Warner Brothers didn't make it here. Taylor and Rothman Productions, which was the production company formed by Julian Rothman, who's the director, and Nat Taylor, who's the producer and was something of an impresario. He had a lot of production facilities located in Toronto. He was also one of the sort of key folks for Famous Players movie theaters. And they really formed the production company, and they had a working partnership even before in a previous genre picture called The Bloody Brood that they made in 1959. And they had really formed it as a way to make commercial cinema in Canada, and then they would have sold or licensed it to Warner Brothers subsequently from that. But it was really designed, you know, The Mask came out in 1961. That's really the very end of what if you want to call it, the original golden age of 3D in Hollywood, which was really the sort of mid-50s when you saw a lot of the B pictures coming out of Hollywood that used 3D. And I think one of the real, driving forces was that, you know, a lot of the movie theaters had invested in 3D projection setups, and the product had started, you know, they weren't getting 3D pictures out of Hollywood anymore. So if you have movie theaters and you want to make use of your 3D technology, why not produce a 3D movie? And I think that was one of the big things for Nat Taylor was, let's use this to get some bums in the seats in my theaters.
Which makes sense. Now, didn't Nat Taylor actually own the land that the Canadian Film Centre is now on?
I believe that's all true. Yeah. He was. I mean, Nat Taylor. He had some of the first production facilities. Like we're talking production, post-production, those sorts of labs. That it was him. He underwent in the late 50s, early 60s. Taylor was really interested in bringing outside productions to Toronto to really start what we would now call the service industry in Toronto, where you get a lot of American, a lot of European co-production shoots that come to Toronto to use not only the landscape but also the crews. So he was like a very instrumental, major force in the English language Canadian film industry on the sort of industrial side to get the capacity up and actually get business in there. So yeah, you're absolutely. He was like a pretty monumental figure. It's funny that, you know, of his production credits, his name is attached to, you know, sort of a B movie, you know, of the time. Yet I think there's a lot to be proud of, even in that.
Well, it's a pretty well-made film.
It is.
Compared to a lot of B films, and it makes me think of not just AIP, but also who I thought was probably the best B movie director ever, Edgar Ulmer.
Sure.
It has a very Black Cat and Detour. It really has a good feel of story, as opposed to some of those other movies where were just very to get you jumping.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things I've always really loved about the movie is that it's as good, probably better than a lot of the sort of similar genre titles that were coming out at the time. Certainly in comparison to things like William Castle, who I think the movie, you know, The Mask is clearly indebted to some of the ideas that William Castle was doing around sort of audience participation and that sort of 4D effect of things like The Tingler and Smell-O-Vision and all that sort of era of theatrical exhibition. And The Mask definitely plays into that, although I think it's a much more subtle and sort of clever and story-based application of audience participation than you see in a lot of the other sort of William Castle stuff. I also find the movie still legitimately scary, which I don't think you can say for a lot of those B movies that were made at the time. I think a lot of the practical effects that were used, you know, they didn't age as well. Here, because all the practical effects are really in the 3D sequences, which are psychedelic, to understate it, I think they disguise a lot of that stuff, and I'm still very unnerved by those 3D sequences. I have still no clue after many viewings what they mean or even really what the hell's going on in them. And I think that, to me, sort of elevates it above some of that and implies a connection to what horror would ultimately become, horror movies in Canada and their sort of larger meaning. Because I think it's interesting that, you know, in horror movies and genre films in Canada, they're treated very seriously. Like and we now regard many of them as sort of some of the best movies ever produced in Canada. They've certainly played an integral role in the real growth of a commercial industry in English Canada, if you think of people like David Cronenberg. And the fact that Cronenberg never really played his stuff for laughs. Like they weren't joking around, those movies. They're trying to scare you. And I think what's interesting about The Mask is it's never tongue-in-cheek. It's never, well, I think some of the stylistic now we can laugh at and take it as camp. I think the 3D, the real elemental sort of scary stuff in the movie is still elemental and scary. And I think that's an interesting link to the movies that would come, say, 2 decades later after The Mask, when you've got Cronenberg and some of those filmmakers very much in the peak of their horror powers.